Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As part of Animal Health Awareness and AMR Week, Department of Agriculture vets Damien Barrett and Caroline Garvan join us to discuss the implications of poor health outcomes on farm productivity and provide a checklist of steps to maintain a healthy herd. And I first asked Damien to quantify the cost of poor health.
Good animal health really is the foundation of profitable and sustainable dairy production systems. I think it's fair to say that profitable dairy farming and sustainable dairy farming are inextricably linked, in the sense that we've all becoming more and more aware of greenhouse gases and methane in particular. And a key element of reducing, well, we all know that the levels of methane per litre of milk sold is going to have to come down. But a key element of that is ensuring that the cows that are in production are as productive as possible from as early a stage in their lives as possible, and that they're going to have a long and productive life. Now, in terms of anything that's going to impact on animal health is going to impact on that productivity. For instance, in preparing for this, I reviewed some research and it showed that a severe case of bovine respiratory disease or pneumonia as a calf has the potential to increase the calving interval of a cow by 12%. A scour as a calf, there's going to be a significant reduction in milk yield. So it's not just there and then that the loss is going to be seen. It's going to be seen over the lifetime of the animal. So as the theme of our Animal Health Awareness Week this year is prevention is better than cure. It's an old adage that most wise farmers are well aware of, but it's never been truer, and it's got implications on a wider scale than just the health of the animal. It's also got key implications for the sustainability and profitability of the farm.
Damien, if we're hypercritical of our systems and really proactive, should we be earmarking animals that have had a significant health event such as pneumonia or scour as a calf? If that's a female, should we be considering whether that animal is suitable or unsuitable as a replacement to enter the dairy herd?
That certainly should be considered. Any of these animals are not going to be reaching their targets on time. Like we're all aiming for heifers to be calving down at 24 months of age, and ideally calving down at the earlier part of the calving season, because there is going to be some level of slippage in terms of calving interval. Like most cows are doing very well to calve again within the 365 days. So like some of these animals are going to identify themselves by foreculling, in the sense that they're not going to reach those targets on time, and maybe people should be a bit more ruthless in selecting animals for breeding. That if they're going to be allowing animals in that haven't reached those targets, hoping they're going to make it up in later, more than likely they're not going to make it up, and more than likely these animals are going to have a premature exit from the herd. And if we're in a scenario where there are plenty of replacements, I think people should be an awful lot more selective.
And then looking to incidence of disease on farm, Damien, what are the key early signs that farmers can look to and say, I think I might be in trouble here, and take a proactive measure before it gets out of control?
It depends very much on the actual disease, but a good rule of thumb, I suppose, is that either say a disease exceeds 5% of the animals involved, or that you have a very large number of cases in a very short space of time. Say, for instance, in a smaller herd, maybe could even be 3 or 4 cases of, say, pneumonia or diarrhea in calves, or particularly abortion. Abortion can be quite an important telltale for other diseases, because abortion will result from fever of anything, and can actually be quite an indicator of an exotic disease incursion as well. So, and anytime you see say significant numbers of abortions happen in a short space of time, or even relatively small numbers of abortions, that needs to be investigated promptly, because you don't want it to get a foothold in the herd, these things are much easier dealt with early on, rather than essentially a salvage operation, if such a thing was to get a hold of within a herd.
And we do see the odd case of an abortion in the sheds, from this time of year on, before cows start to calve down. Sometimes it can be, an encounter with another cow. It's not necessarily that it is a disease, but talk through the investigation you're talking about, where you see an abortion on farms. Are you talking about, dropping the fetus to the regional veterinary lab?
That's it in a nutshell. It's the question of dropping the fetus, along with the cleaning, if that's available, and getting a blood sample from the cow to rule out the common cause of abortion. People were probably an awful lot more aware of this prior to the eradication of brucellosis. And I'd say there's a certain level of complacency has entered the fray since brucellosis has been eradicated. Like, there is an obligation on farmers to report and have abortions investigated, which really was part of the brucellosis legislation. When brucellosis thankfully is no longer with us, I think people aren't as aware of that, but nonetheless, abortion is a very important telltale, or an indicator of a disease event, and it never should be looked upon lightly.
Going down the route, you talk about a fever is generally the cause of abortion. What are the typical diseases that are causing that fever?
Well, it's just abortion is a byproduct of any fever. Like, that could be something as simple or as straightforward as a summer mastitis, or which earlier in the year, it could be a pneumonia or anything like that. So that's for, say, a generalized systemic disease event. The fever is not necessarily a feature of the common abortifacient agents like leptospirosis, salmonellosis. There are, say, listeria, or those type of bacteria. It's not necessarily a standout feature of it, but the fever I'm referring to is more, say, probably a more of a rare event, a once off, unless you're looking at the introduction of an exotic disease. Where, like Schmallenberg, like fever was definitely a feature of Schmallenberg infection.
And Caroline, to you, when we consider the AMR challenge that exists, could you give us some information on how this concept is linked with the One Health?
Well, AMR is the key One Health issue, Emma-Louise, because we all depend on antibiotics, both in the human health sector and in the animal health sector, to treat disease. And we share the same families of antibiotics. So we're both using these antibiotics. And every time you use an antibiotic, be it in ourselves or in our cattle, you are driving the development of resistance, which means if you continue using it, eventually the bacteria will not be susceptible to it. So we'll run out of disease treatment options, and it's because of this shared diseases as well. Diseases travel across, like Salmonella, Campylobacter. They go back and forth between the human and animal population. So that brings in the One Health concept, and also the role of the environment, which is the one that has sort of been left out up to now, really, is that every time you treat an animal with an antibiotic, up to 60% of it is excreted into the environment, and that antibiotic then meets the bacteria in the environment and can cause development of resistance in those bacteria, which can then meet other disease-causing bacteria, which infect ourselves or our animals. So you've got this big multifactorial soup, if you like, where everyone is using the same medicines and living in the same environment, and there's crossover of diseases. COVID is a good example, but over, I think it's 70% of diseases in humans come from the animal population. So that's where it comes under the One Health concept, if you like.
And looking from a dairy farm perspective, can you give us some of the practical farm practices that we could work towards in order to become more sustainable and reduce our risk of AMR?
Sure, absolutely. And the first thing I would say is that we have developed a nice code of practice between the veterinary sector, the farming sector, and Teagasc that highlights the steps, the guidelines, and it's on our website under gov.ie/AMR. But I suppose in that it highlights 7 particular guidelines. The first one being what Damien has been talking about, the whole idea of optimal animal health. So preventing disease, because if you don't have disease, you don't use antibiotics. The other thing farmers need to consider is having, a living herd health plan. So, what are my diseases on farm? What are the suitable treatments? How can I avoid these diseases? And mastitis is a key one, which we can discuss later. But the other thing you can build in is biosecurity. So, you try and have a closed herd. Increase your use of vaccines. We're very much seeing things moving that way. The sales of vaccines have now surpassed the sales of antibiotics. So that's all very positive. And sometimes it's a case of investing now in a vaccine to see the long-term gain. The other thing you can do, obviously, is look at your management strategies to keep the animals stress-free, because overcrowding, poor ventilation, all these things are stresses that precipitate disease and the possible need to use antibiotics. And I suppose what we have developed within the department and with the stakeholders is this 6 rights policy. So you have the right veterinary diagnosis in the first place, so that you're not treating a viral disease, it's a bacterial disease, because only bacterial diseases need antibiotics. And then that you're treating the right animal, the animal that needs it, that you're not doing group treatment and you're using the right antibiotic, because you have different classes now of antibiotics. We have certain antibiotics which should never be used as a first-line treatment because they are drugs of last resort in human health. And then the key thing is to give the right dose for the right duration, because if you underdose, you're obviously not killing the bacteria properly and you're promoting development of the resistance. And if you don't give it for long enough, that's the other thing, again, you're promoting development of resistance. So always follow the course. If it says 3 days, don't stop after day 2, even if the calf is skipping around the shed. And the last thing farmers can do is correctly store the antibiotic, but also dispose of it correctly, because you don't want the antibiotic leaching out into the environment. So, I mean, they're key guidelines, really. And I suppose if you want to look at the different age groups, as Damien mentioned in the calves, really optimal calf health is getting your colostrum in, following the 1-2-3 rule, giving the first milk within 2 hours and giving 3 litres. And I suppose, it's generally building up. It all centres around having a herd health plan and building on your health that's there to look always to be continually trying to optimise the animal health in your herd.
And Caroline, like from the 7 steps that you've documented there, I think it's no harm for a farmer to even write those down and then walk through each of the steps and consider, where do I sit? Am I, good, average or poor in this category? And you mentioned the herd health. There are really good structures and example plans in terms of vaccinations and treatments for animals with ill health, and it's to, I guess, consider it and adapt it to your particular situation. One of the things you mentioned, Caroline, is in some instances antibiotics should not be used, and something that dairy farmers are becoming more and more aware of is the use of antibiotics at dry cow, or the selective dry cow therapy where you're using sealer only on low cell count cows. How important is this practice going to be on dairy farms in the future?
It's going to be really important, Emma-Louise, because, we talk about the buzzword being sustainability. It's no longer considered sustainable at a social level. to keep using antibiotics randomly without due justification. And so this blanket dry cow therapy, where it was treat all the animals, even perhaps some animals that might necessarily have needed it, is no longer going to be considered acceptable, particularly when we're looking for other markets, to sell our produce. So really, and the other key driver is there's new legislation coming into force on the 28th of January, and it's the veterinary medicines legislation, and a key driver in that legislation is to address AMR in the human health sector, but also in the animal health sector, by reducing the use of antibiotics. And there is one article in that legislation that specifically looks at the whole preventative use of antibiotics, and that feeds directly into our dry cow therapy, which is in essence, you're using the antibiotics to prevent disease during the dry period. And so what that legislation is saying, that it can only be used in individual animals in exceptional circumstances. So, vets, when they're going to prescribe, when this new legislation comes into place, will be influenced a lot by their code of practice that's laid out by the Veterinary Council of Ireland. They're answerable to the Veterinary Council in how they prescribe antibiotics. And, they will be very much looking at reducing the level of antibiotic use on farms at drying off. And so key to that would be farmers considering, have I enough information to know exactly what's going on in each animal? And things like milk recording are going to become really, really important. And we do know that the level of milk recording is continuing to increase. I think we're at over 40% at the moment. And that's really positive, because there is research out there showing that farmers that take up milk recording can increase their yield, increase their actual earnings by €210 per dairy cow. And it also shows that you get a decline in your overall bulk milk tank somatic cell count by 23%, because you have much better evidence, you have much better information to know which cows actually need the antibiotic and which ones don't. And obviously there's certain thresholds, there's risk when you do go down the selective dry cow therapy route. But AHI have developed, there's TASA workshops out there, and there's a lot of support there. But the bottom line is farmers are going to have to move towards this. They are going to have to look at their practices, because the goalposts have moved. And the other thing to mention is there are now these critically important antibiotics, drugs of last resort, and some of them are in our dry cow tubes. And really now there's a code of practice that has been developed for vets that's saying that they cannot be used, that these treatments, these particular tubes should not be used for first-line treatment, and that there needs to be culture and susceptibility testing done to justify the use. So that test result will show you, yes, I need to use this particular tube because nothing else works. But the reality is, when we look at the results, at our laboratory results, most mastitis are susceptible to the penicillins, the lower class of antibiotic, and there really isn't a huge justification for using these critically important antibiotics. And the other thing is cost. Obviously, these particular tubes with these more important antibiotics are more expensive. So there's a lot to balance up, and I suppose really we're all on the learning curve, but the message is, the practices that were there in the past can't continue around blanket dry cow therapy.
And I think, Caroline, it's really interesting, all of the benefits that you have mentioned, improved production, reduction in the bulk tank cell count, to name a few things, and not to mind the reduction in costs of the antibiotic products that farmers have used so regularly in the past. And it's interesting, as we have this conversation around selective dry cow therapy, I heard some farms who have actually been doing it over a prolonged period of time, and they have animals that are culled at 10th and 11th lactation who have never actually received an antibiotic in their lifetime, which is a really interesting and fascinating feat that they have achieved. And it's something that all farmers can achieve, and it is with that knowledge and power that you talk about in terms of milk recording. Finally, to you, Damien, you mentioned that our conversation today is at the start of Animal Health Awareness and AMR Week. Can you give us any of the interesting features of the programme in the next week that might be of interest to dairy farmers?
we're holding a series of webinars over the week, starting on November the 18th to coincide with European Antibiotic Day. On Tuesday the 23rd, this is going to be the herd health webinar, which probably is going to be of the most interest to dairy farmers in particular. Our first speaker is Ailish Moriarty from a Nuffield scholar that works with the Kerry group, who's going to speak about her scholarship on the use of bulk milk antibody testing as a screening tool for disease. We're going to hear more about the selective dry cow therapy, which Caroline referred to earlier on. We also have a speaker from the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons in the UK, Fiona Lovett, who's going to speak about the initiative that the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons is having to encourage reduced antimicrobial usage. And we're also going to have a talk on emerging threats from parasites, say in terms of whether its effect on parasite burdens and antibiotic resistance. We're finishing up then on November the 24th, and this is going to be about emerging threats. And these are, our first speaker is going to be from Philip Robinson from the Harper Adams Veterinary School in the UK, but he's going to talk about his experience as a practitioner in Northern Ireland in 2001, how he diagnosed foot and mouth. As well as being a practitioner, he's the son of a dairy farmer, and as he will describe how the implications of that when he diagnosed foot and mouth that day in Northern Ireland, he couldn't go home because he had to stay away from the home farm. We've also got talks that evening on blue tongue, African swine fever, AMR, and a case study on low path avian influenza. Now, some of these topics may not directly affect dairy cattle, but the principles of biosecurity and keeping disease out, I think, are relevant to all livestock farmers. So I think there's something of interest to everybody in that lineup. So we'd be hoping many of our listeners would register and tune in.
That's great. Thank you, Damien, and thank you, Caroline.
Thanks
very much.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Damien Barrett and Caroline Garvan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.